So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 9th annual Touro University, California's Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series, hosted by the Public Health Program. My name is Gail Cummings, and I am the director of the Public Health Program, and I am joined by Dr. Deirdre Wilson, who serves as the chair for the Community Action for Health Concentration in the Master Public Health Program here at Touro University, California. And together we coordinate and host the Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series. Before we begin today's seminar, we want to make sure that we pause and reflect that regardless of where we are, we sit on stolen land. The city of Vallejo, which is home of Touro University, California, exists on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Confederate villages of the Lijan, the Karkin, the Mawekama, and the Patwin peoples. We also pause to remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of our survivors. And we acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who have contributed to building this country and continue to serve in our labor force. And as we do this work, it is our collective responsibility to pause and really critically understand these histories to repair harm that has impacted generations and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. If this is your first time joining us, the purpose of the seminar series is to provide upstream discussions around social justice and public health for students in our MPH programs and professionals in public health, medicine, education, pharmacy, and nursing degree programs, as well as for our community and global partners and leaders. Each year, we focus on a different topic, and we are excited about every topic, but this topic seems exceptionally exciting for us. It's entitled The Impacts of Technology on Health Equity and Social Justice, Technology, the Conduit to Public Health in the World. So over the next 6 sessions in this series, we will hear from leading experts across diverse fields of health policy, public health, technoscience, history, and social justice, who will help us understand the current technology landscape with discussions centered around how it is developed, how it's deployed, and regulated, all of which can promote and undermine social justice and health equity. We have been extremely fortunate to bring remarkable speakers to the series over the past 8 years, and this year does not disappoint. We are absolutely thrilled to continue this tradition with our keynote presenter, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who will kick off this year's series. Before we bring on Dr. Benjamin, we do have a little housekeeping, and I would also like to acknowledge and congratulate our 2023 Social Justice Fellows, Valeria Garcia, Ashkan Hassani, Grace Wang, Danielle Miguel, and Alana Stevens, all of whom are students who have demonstrated their deep commitment to building leadership and advocacy skills to further the social justice mission of our program and public health overall. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deirdre Wilson, who is the chair of the Community Action for Health Concentration.
Good evening, everyone, and again, welcome. We are really looking forward to Dr. Benjamin's presentation, but before we begin, I want to encourage our students to be sure to go to the Canvas course for all of the course information. And as a roadmap for this evening, we will have Dr. Benjamin's presentation following with a discussion and Q&A. In order to have your questions addressed, please list all questions in the Q&A function in our webinar. We also have various continuing education opportunities, and that information will be posted in the chat, along with information in the following slides. If you would like continuing medical education, We do offer it this evening for the session tonight. You can go to the eeds.com and include the activity link code, which will also be in the chat. If you're interested in our social justice badges, we have social justice badges for each of the series, including the 2023 series this fall and previous years. And that information will also be in the chat if you'd like to enroll. And finally, we have a new offering, our Socially Just Public Health Perspectives for Change podcast, which will also provide a synopsis of each of the sessions and some continued discussion with our presenter. So now let's introduce Dr. Ruha Benjamin. She is an Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab, and author of the award-winning books Race After Technology, Abolition Tools for the New Jim Code, and Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want, 2022. Dr. Benjamin earned a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Spelman College. She earned an MA and PhD in Sociology from UC Berkeley and completed postdoctoral fellowships at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics and Harvard's Science, Technology, and Society program. She is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Societies National Science Foundation, Marguerite Casey Foundation Freedom Scholar Award, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Thumbs up. Awesome. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I know how busy your lives are and all of the things tugging at your time and schedules. So I really appreciate you logging in and joining us for this conversation. I'll try to keep you awake for the next hour or so. So you see here, the title of my presentation is The New Jim Code, Innovation, Imagination, and Inequity in the Digital Age. And it is really special for me to be in conversation with so many people in the Bay Area, because that's really where I got my start in thinking about these issues. As a graduate student at Berkeley, one of the insights that I came across in the form of a question that ended up in my dissertation and then my first book is shown here. Why am I in such demand as a research subject when no one wants me as a patient? And this was articulated by someone who was affected by sickle cell disease. And it was at a time when the state of California was investing billions of dollars into stem cell research on the one hand, and at the same time was not providing basic health care to the vast majority of the population. And I remember at the time that I was studying the stem cell initiative, when it came on the ballot for residents in California to vote on Prop 71, at the same time that that was voted up, Prop 72 was voted down. Prop 72 would have extended employee-based healthcare to millions of people. And so to get us started, I want us to think about this as a kind of a lopsided investment, a lopsided imagination where we can imagine future healthcare in the form of regenerative medicine and stem cell research, and seeing researchers growing cardiac cells in a petri dish. And we can't imagine providing basic everyday care to people yesterday. That to me is a lopsided investment. We are trying to revive bodies and we have an ailing body politic. And so it got me really thinking critically about why we have so much excitement about novel technologies. And we have a sort of limp investment and imagination when it comes to our society and social transformation. And it brings to mind an insight from Black feminist writer Toni Cade Bambara that not all speed is movement. And for me, I can apply this insight to so many areas of my life when it comes to racing after things. Not all speed is movement, but here I want us to apply it to technological speed, the race to create new, novel, shinier gadgets, tools, technologies, systems, and that doesn't necessarily signal progress. We have to disentangle technological speed from social progress. So you see here this iconic image from a previous era of racial oppression. And oftentimes we're creating technologies that simply provide a veneer for business as usual, not really challenging the underlying forms of harm, exclusion, oppression. And so what I want to invite us to do is not to get caught in these false choices, worse and worser, but to think about what else can we envision for the future. And this applies not just to policing, but to education, to healthcare, to work, to think about what we're critical of and what we want to create. If we don't think that investing billions of dollars into policing is going to make us safer, what else do we have to grow? What else do we have to grow in our communities, in our educational system, in our workplaces? What do we have to seed as an alternatives? And so that's the invitation. Now, let's come to technology, right? That's the focus of this particular session. And I want to suggest when it comes to the dominant ways in which we talk about and think about the technology in society, there are two main stories that we tell. The first one on your left is what we might call the techno-dystopian story or narrative, this idea that technology is associated with everything bad. It's going to make everything more oppressive. It's going to take all the jobs. It's going to remove human agency. This is the techno-dystopian narrative that Hollywood loves to sell us. On the other hand, we have the idea that technology is going to save us. On your right, everything good is associated with emerging technologies. It's going to make everything more fair, more efficient. If only we would hand over our major decisions to these automated systems, we'd be in better hands. And of course, until recently, this was the story that Silicon Valley loved to sell us. While these seem like opposing narratives, right? They have different endings, one in which we're slayed, one in which we're saved. They actually share an underlying logic, what we will call a techno-deterministic logic. The assumption that technology has a will of its own. It is going full speed ahead, and we just have to deal with the impacts, for better or worse. We have to mitigate the harms. There's a sort of inevitability around the development of technology that applies to both stories, even though they have different endings. And I want us to watch out for the way that we inadvertently fall into the trap of techno-determinism, assuming that we don't have a choice in what technologies are developed, if technologies are developed as solutions to various social problems. We have to pull back the screen and think about who are the humans behind all of this, the human values, agents, agencies, worldviews, desires that are getting encoded into our digital environments and that we have to then inhabit. As it stands, a small sliver of humanity currently is encoding the world that the rest of us have to navigate, right? A small sliver of humanity. And so in some ways, we could say that we're caught in someone else's imagination of what the future should be, of what real education or healthcare or work is. Those who are creating these systems without much public input or say. And so I think pulling back the screen has been easier to do in hindsight. When we look historically, we are able to think more critically about these tools and technologies when it comes to so-called deadly data. For example, the role of the company IBM in the Nazi Holocaust, providing the punch card technology to keep track of populations as a precursor for genocide. So that while many people still associate these mass atrocities with a few big bad boogeymen, we know that it required what one author calls a bureaucracy of evil. Just people doing their jobs, clocking in and out, not asking too many hard questions, just doing their jobs. And so we might consider, what are the bureaucracies of evil that are operating today, which are right under our noses, where we're not asking the hard questions, when it comes not just to deadly data in the past, but do-gooding data today. For example, one of many that I could pluck, the Community Innovation Project from St. Paul, Minnesota. In this case, the school system joined forces with the police force under the guise of this project to create a data sharing platform that would identify, quote, at-risk youth in the city, essentially using a bunch of different forms of data to predict whether young people were going to be future criminals. And so this data sharing platform, as community members got wind of it, they started to ask hard questions. They picked their head up and said, wait a minute, what forms of data are you using? Where are you getting it from? Suspension records, attendance records, whether kids are involved with child protective services, their family members in jail or prison. And they said, none of the institutions where you're getting this data have ever worked in the best interests of our young people. So why now, under the guise of the Community Innovation Project, should we trust that things are going to turn out differently? And so over the course of about a year, this community in St. Paul organized, they met in focus groups and town hall meetings, and eventually put an end to this project, but also said, give us the resources that you were about to pour into this, and let us actually plant the things that and seed the things that will actually foster the potential and the well-being of the youth in our community. So you see, they were both critical and creative when it came to thinking about the role of technology in their society. And so what they showed to us is a keen ability to read reality, to look beneath the shiny exterior, beyond the buzzwords, community, innovation, project that we're inundated with, and say, what's actually happening behind the screen? Who's actually putting this together, and to what ends? And so in the same way that they are able to read reality because of their lived experience with these institutions, we too have to develop this skill and hone this skill. And so I think it's hard to do for a number of reasons. One is that racism and other forms of inequality actually distort our vision, distort our ability to read accurately the patterns between our institutions, our interpersonal, internal dynamics. And so this distorting effect is not just something that's a problem in the US, but globally, when we look at the various fault lines around the world and how that intersects with technologies that are then developed, whether we look to our neighbors in the north and the way that our indigenous brothers and sisters are treated both in the healthcare system and throughout all arenas in society, whether we look to places like France that in many ways still tries to purport this colorblind ideology. We don't see race, we don't see difference, we're all French. And yet our Muslim brothers and sisters tell a different story. Immigrant communities there tell a different story in terms of the everyday forms of discrimination they experience. Again, this is a global phenomenon. Whether we go to somewhere like the place of my birth in India and look at the way that caste discrimination operates there and intersects with the healthcare system, we know that these forms of fatal couplings of power and difference, as Stuart Hall would tell us, take different forms depending where in the world you are, including in seemingly homogenous societies like Japan, where Japanese of Korean descent are treated like second-class citizens in education and housing. And so part of it is to have this global view, but understand the specificity, the different histories that are taking shape, not just at a national level, but regionally in our different locales, to think about how we have to intervene with the specific dynamics in mind. And so it shouldn't surprise us that these forms of inequality are encoded into seemingly neutral tools and technologies. For example, the pulse oximeter during COVID, where more and more people were starting to use this as a way to figure out whether they needed to rush to the hospital. My colleague at MIT, Amy Moran Thomas, wrote this powerful article in the Boston Review, which shows the way that racism intersects with the design of this device. She writes, like the problems magnified by the coded gaze of algorithms elsewhere, even small racial disparities could amplify unequal outputs. Beyond the pulse ox, this also matters for other wearable chromatic devices and the algorithms they feed. Pretending that they're colorblind can further amplify health disparities. And so again, we shouldn't be surprised if these forms of inequality saturate through all other arenas of our society. Of course, it's going to show up in healthcare and public health, including our medical devices. Another quite alarming and controversial case relates to the use of race norming, or quote, race correcting algorithms. One in particular that's been used in the NFL to decide whether players are eligible for payouts from the settlement for brain injuries. Come to find out that this race correcting algorithm was employed, and it's based on a discriminatory assumption that Black players start with a lower cognitive function than their white counterparts, which then disqualifies them injured from years of concussions from receiving payouts. And so at the end of the talk, I'll kind of hint to where how awareness around this has changed this practice, which is what we should be advocating for, because this idea of race correcting has this deep history and is often used in order to bar players, patients, and other groups from receiving necessary services and resources. And so before I get to that, and before we do a slightly deeper dive into the more advanced algorithms and AI, I want to give you an analog example, something that you could describe to the kindergartner in your families to help them understand this idea of coded inequity. So this bench actually is a photo I took in Berkeley. It's right on the corner of, I think, Shattuck and Ashby, close to the flea market that I used to love to go to and get curry rotis and sit for a little while before moving on with the business of the day. I took this photo in February. And at that time, I was living in Boston. Winter, wanting to sit in the sun for a few minutes between meetings, and realized I couldn't comfortably lay down and soak in the rays the way that I really wanted to because of the way the bench was designed. And you can think of all kinds of practical reasons for those armrests, right? Literally to put your elbows on, for elderly to get up and down. When I was 9 months pregnant, certainly that could come in handy. If a stranger's sitting on one end, you might be more likely to sit down with that invisible air wall. But my mind went to probably what most of you are thinking. But the armrests also prevent people from sleeping on the bench, people who you don't want sleeping on the bench. And so keeping in mind, this is the Bay Area. And with the tech boom, the housing crisis has grown exponentially. At one point, 1 in 3 school children in Palo Alto were experiencing housing insecurity. And so to think about the function of this bench in a context in which many more people are experiencing housing precarity adds a different dimension to it, a social function to it. And so I did a little digging, and I found, in fact, it's a global phenomenon again, that what architects call hostile architecture. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki, only one booty at a time, no sleeping, laying down there. I found caged benches in France. In this case, the mayor installed these in the town square, and within 24 hours, the people in the town petitioned to have them removed, which reminds us that we don't simply have to submit or click submit to discriminatory forms of design. We can work together to ensure that our public space, just as our public policy, reflects our values. But my favorite example in this whole bench metaphor is the spiked bench or the metered bench, which actually has these spikes built into it. You put some coins in and the spikes retreat for about 15 or 20 minutes. And so in this case, the idea of the harm and exclusion is made very explicit. And it was created originally by a German artist to get us thinking critically about these questions of design, about coded forms of inequity, the metering of social life, more broadly? What other areas of our lives are things nominally for everyone? This is a public bench, but because of the way it's designed, it's pushing people out or harming people. The metering of education, the metering of healthcare. And so if we think with the bench and this idea of discriminatory design, we can ask ourselves this question again and again. What are the spikes we're building into our own work in public health, in medicine? Perhaps we didn't build the bench. We just started a new position. Someone hands us the bench and says, this is the way we do things here. These are the directions. Do we just put our head down, follow directions, don't ask any questions? Or do we call attention to the spikes? Do we work with other people who are also, concerned about the spikes to redesign and reimagine what we're doing together in our work? And so I want to suggest, thinking with this metaphor a little bit longer, that there are more obvious forms of harm and insidious forms of harm. Remember the deadly data and the do-gooding data? So the deadly data is easier to see coming, right? We can see the harms more evidently. In this case, a bench from South Africa, whites only. It just tells us, what's going on, who it's for, who it's not for. It's in our face. And many of us, we can see this and recognize, okay, something's wrong. But what we have to develop is the capacity to see the more insidious harms and exclusions, where the surface looks very welcoming and inclusive, has all the right buzzwords: community, innovation, project, the buzzwords on our universities' websites, the buzzwords in our organizations. And yet the underlying structure hasn't changed. The form of exclusion that coded inequity is still there. And so we have to be able to look beneath the shiny, welcoming exterior and look to the way things are actually operating behind the screens, behind the surface. And so let's apply this distinction to a few examples just to make sure it's well planted. So, obvious form of harm in the context of policing. We have here an image from North Miami where the police officers were using these faces for target practice. The only reason we know this is because the sister of one of these young men was in the National Guard and went to the same shooting range and saw her brother's face in the trash with a bullet hole through the forehead. And so she brought it to the public attention, to the media, and the concern spread. And one of the sort of footnotes to this, the same way the people in that town in France rallied together to have those benches removed, in this case, many different types of people, but specifically clergy in the area, many of them white clergy, got on social media using the hashtag #UseMeInstead, putting their faces as a way to draw attention to the hypocrisy and harm associated with this practice, this everyday practice of anti-Blackness, which, of course, when these officers hit the streets, if this is what they're training on, it's no wonder that the same profile it receives the brunt of brutality and violence. So obvious form of harm in our face. But throw some technology in the mix. Many people think, well, if we have a problem with bias and discriminatory police, maybe if we just have more, objective technologies that are making these decisions, we would be in better hands. But we know that through the employment of facial recognition tools, through predictive policing technologies, that the same communities who've been profiled, because their data is part of training these systems, we're seeing very similar patterns of harm and exclusion. In this case, this is one of the first cases in which facial recognition created a false arrest of this young man. And so again, just throwing some technology in the mix is not necessarily going to address the underlying structure or root of the problem. Turning to education now, obvious form of harm. Some colleagues put some eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and had them look at children playing together and then said, look for the challenging behavior. And the vast majority of those teachers' attention went to the little Black children in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. They were hired child actors instructed on how to behave. And so whether we're talking about profiling in adulthood or in preschool, we see the pattern emerge in which the educational system or the law enforcement system is infected with this distorted vision of who people are and what they're capable of. So we throw some technology in the mix. We know when it comes to our colleges and universities, many of them are using algorithms to predict the success of students, deciding whether or not they're likely to graduate. And in one of the first audits of the student success predictor score, researchers have found large disparities, that Black students are routinely deemed higher risk than their white counterparts. And not just any Black students, especially those in STEM fields. And so you can imagine that these risk scores are often used to steer students out of particular majors under the guise of a more objective evaluation. That is, a counselor or advisor is saying, it's not me who thinks you can't handle it. Look, the algorithm has said you're high risk. And so I want us to talk a little bit about this particular case and this idea of predicting risk, because in my view, if we're going to deploy these tools, I'm concerned about why are we training them on the most vulnerable in these contexts. Let's predict who's creating risk for these students. Let's look at the departments. Let's look at the fields that are creating hostile environments that then students have to navigate, and let's label them high risk or risk producing instead of focusing on the students. Now turning to healthcare, which is closest to home for most of you. We know, again, obvious forms of harm. We have social science data piled to my ceiling that shows that from medical students to physicians to attendees all the way across the board, that there are everyday forms of anti-Blackness and discrimination that infect our healthcare system. And one area in particular that has received a lot of attention, it has to do with pain assessment. And the fact, again, remember the distorted lens, the distorted vision, that Black patients' pain is routinely underdiagnosed. And so what if we threw some technology into our healthcare system? Would that help us bypass this form of bias? Well, we know, again, through one of the first audits of a widely used healthcare algorithm, that there's a significant racial bias, and that Black patients were routinely pushed out of programs where they would have gotten more services and more attention and more care. And so when we think about these examples of obvious and insidious, we have to evaluate them in the context of histories of harm and discrimination. These problems are not caused by the technology, but amplified and spread through them. The technologies are reflecting prior forms of anti-Blackness or discrimination, whether in policing or in education or in healthcare. And these are the dots that I'm trying to connect in this work, between historical and ongoing forms of tech-mediated inequality. And one of the concepts that I introduce in these two works is that of the new Jim Code, hence the title of my presentation. This is a way to think about the relationship between coded bias and imagined objectivity. So if you imagine my grandmother, her generation, she would have walked up to a hospital and seen a big whites only sign, like that whites only bench. The harm, the exclusion is in her face. There's no question. There's an arrow pointing to the Negro wing. Now I can walk through the front door of most healthcare establishments, and there may very well be a healthcare algorithm making decisions about my care that produces the same patterns of resource allocation and discrimination without me even knowing about it. Someone sitting behind a screen and plugging in numbers and making decisions about my care that reproduce forms of health disparities in our system. And this is what I term the new Jim Code, as a way to evoke that prior history, that prior era, and think about how it's the input to our current tech-mediated forms of harm. Which leads to the question then, looking at the time, what do we do? What do we do about it? And of course, there are all kinds of things that we have to do at the legislative level in terms of top-down policymaking to create protections and accountability, whether it's the Algorithmic Accountability Act or the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. There are all kinds of ways in which we have to push for these protections to transform the digital ecology that we have to inhabit and work within. But there are also a number of bottom-up forms of organizing and advocacy that we could do yesterday. even as we work on the policy front. And we can join arms with others in order to start making changes that matter now. Many of these things are being led at the community level by organizations like the Detroit Community Technology Project, the Algorithmic Justice League, founded by Joy Buolamwini, the Data for Black Lives movement that is led by Yeshi Milner. And so these are just a few, and there are many at the local, regional, national, and globally. I could have a whole other presentation that points to how people in other countries are working on tech justice movements. But there's also at the level of learning and education, literacy when it comes to technology, that we can begin to foster in our own organizations, in our own disciplines and professions. One easily accessible resource, someone can actually look this up and drop the link in the chat, Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook, that has a really short and useful bibliography that you can use as a starting point to dig into these issues a little bit more. And the goal of this is threefold: to develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media platforms, technologies not yet developed; an emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations within organizations; and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. And so again, this is at the bottom-up level of cultural transformation and consciousness raising that we could all play a part in, and start a book club that uses this as a starting point and dig into some of these other issues. At the level of our professions and thinking about the role of medicine in creating the problem and now responsible for also counteracting it, we've had a number of recent developments led by scholars like Dorothy Roberts and others to challenge and put an end to race correction in clinical algorithms. And so I encourage you to put in some keywords and look at what's been happening along these lines as, again, an important area where we see this transformation. And thinking about the role of health professionals across the spectrum as in many ways the front lines where people are most vulnerable and often experience this embodied racism through our healthcare system and our public health interactions. They're also on the front lines of change, thinking about how racism, the pandemic of racism, has gone along with the pandemic of COVID. And so I really want to shout out those who understand that part of their job in treating patients and the whole patient is really taking a stand and working to dismantle racism within the healthcare system and within our institutions. And so, again, thinking about this movement as not something outside of what we do or extra, but intrinsic to who and what we listen to. And so as a kind of a wrapping up these series of examples of how people are taking a stand, I want to point to one example in particular of a group of researchers who have been thinking about this history of health disparities and specifically pain, discrimination around pain, and building those insights into their work. And so in this case, what they did was they didn't train the algorithms to predict what doctors were going to say about patients' pain. Rather, they trained it to predict what the patient was going to say about their own experiences of pain. So you think about this, it's shifting the idea of who the experts are. And so if we know that there's this long-standing anti-Black bias in pain treatment, if we just take those doctors' reports and train these technical systems to reflect that, it's going to reproduce and amplify that. But in this case, they said, well, let's shift the source of knowledge and turn to patients themselves. And so not only were the predictions more accurate, but they were also less racially biased. And so I want us to think about that, and how different that is, that way of taking pain seriously, in contrast to what some of my colleagues have rightly termed structural gaslighting by medical professionals. All right. So for example, after Officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, the medical establishment doctored the truth. Here, quoting Floyd's initial coroner's report, the autopsy revealed no physical findings that supported diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia of strangulation. Mr. Floyd had underlying health conditions, including coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease. So this is textbook structural gaslighting. So for more on this concept, I want you to visit this Scientific American article. But my point here is that the medical establishment has not simply been a bystander, but has aided and abetted explicit and implicit forms of racism, in part by creating scientific sounding alibis for those who perpetuate more obvious harms. The same gaslighting was evident in Dr. Eli Kleinman's report of Eric Garner's murder by Officer Pantaleo in New York City, in which the doctor claimed Garner's poor health and not Pantaleo's chokehold was to blame. So with this in mind, I'm going to suggest that there are two medical traditions, the one enabling and the other opposing racist violence. The first one, exemplified by Kleinman's testimony, entails the historic and ongoing collusion of scientists, doctors, public health professionals with the powers that be, performing sterilizations in US prisons, enabling torture at Guantanamo, not to mention the everyday neglect and mistreatment of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, disabled, femme, poor, trans, veteran, homeless, undocumented, and other vulnerable patients. This tradition, let's call it medicine as objective oppressor, was also responsible for building the intellectual foundations of scientific racism and mobilizing foot soldiers for eugenics policies around the country and the world. But importantly, this is not the only tradition. There is also a tradition of medical practitioners as not only healers, but truth tellers, whistleblowers, conscientious objectors, witnesses, community partners, and more. Those like Dr. Hannah Atisha, one of the whistleblowers in Flint, Michigan. Those who use their status and authority to challenge the powers that be, and who shine a light on medical abuse and neglect in their own backyards. We could call this tradition medicine as a moral force. And while there are many individuals who carry this tradition forward, including many of you on this call, organizations like White Coats for Black Lives exemplify a more collective approach to transforming our medical institutions and pedagogy. This is an organization of medical students that, in their words, was born in response to apathy. While people were mourning the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and who enraged by the non-indictments of the officers who killed them, the medical institution, which has historically had racism built into its foundation, largely remained silent. So in December 2014, medical students of color and their allies around the country participated in die-ins to honor these individuals and demonstrate a commitment to dismantling the systems that led to their deaths. The actions of these students raised an important question to the institution of medicine. Are medical professionals, public health professionals, responsible for combating racism? For these students, who found themselves committed to a profession that has vowed to support the well-being of all patients and has consistently broken that promise, the answer was an emphatic yes. Their work and others compel us to widen our lens beyond ailing bodies to an ailing body politic. Every profession, in my view, needs a similar reckoning. Not only must we diagnose the deadly nature of everyday forms of injustice, but take seriously the process of collective healing. What does that look like? And what I want to suggest is it looks like not fancy new initiatives and programs and buzzwords and things that get us a lot of attention, but it's about pointing our attention to what's often the fine print, the nitty-gritty of our work, the everyday practices that we're told not to question. And as, for example, our curriculum. This wonderful, again, going to Boston Review, Ann Fauster Sterling wrote several years ago, looking critically at medical curricula, and we could also apply this to public health pedagogy. She writes, the curricular problems run deep. Physicians are often taught outright or through modeled behavior to use racial generalizations and assumptions as shortcuts, resulting at worst in misdiagnosis and at best lost time reaching the right conclusion and treatment. And she goes on to provide some really powerful examples in which students actually took screenshots of their professor's slides to demonstrate the distorted vision that they were being socialized into. And so I encourage you to read this, read that Scientific American article on structural gaslighting, and the article on pulse oximeters, again, as a starting point to deepen your understanding. So to close, this is some concepts that I would love us to chat about if we have time. So if we don't want race correction in the way that the NFL was practicing and many other parts of our clinical approaches have practiced, we could engage in racism correction, right? This is very different. What does racism correction entail as an everyday practice? I want to suggest it entails not doing three things and cultivating two other things that I'll show you in just a minute. So it involves challenging biological determinism. And if you're not sure what that means, ask me about it when we open things up. It involves refuting cultural determinism, which is actually a more insidious form of racism that I want us to be able to recognize in our own thinking and our own institutions. And it involves resisting technological determinism, which I've spent the majority of the presentation focusing on. So if we stop doing these things or become more watchful and discerning around these things, what do we do? Well, there's two practices in particular that I want us to foster. One is this idea of structural competency. If someone could look up structural competency, I think it's .org, and put the link in the chat. I think they offer such a great paradigm that deepens our approach to engaging community. So structural competency married with cultural humility, I think, are two practices, two approaches that I would put under the umbrella of racism correction that we would want to foster. Again, a lot of terms here. We can use that as a starting point to have a discussion about what that looks like. And so my final proposition is this. If inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society. Remember, we saw it from policing to education to healthcare to work, and the list goes on. That means each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers, that we don't just have to carry on doing things the way they've always been done. We can actually question, change, and reimagine the everyday status quo. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to invite anyone to bring up any of the threads that I've shared. I put a lot on the table, so feel free to pick up on any of these and we can chat about it. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Wow. Dr. Benjamin. That's a lot of fascinating information. Thank you so much for that thought-provoking. I don't even want to call those nuggets. Those are big rocks for us to think about as we really take some time to think about the bigger questions that you ask around race correction. And before we get to a number of questions that I think are already in the chat, because you have such an interesting trajectory in terms of how you came to this work, and asking these types of questions. There's a part in your book where you talk about your childhood in South Central LA and sort of the carceral web, I think you call it, in which other people's safety and freedoms are sort of predicated. Can you just talk a little bit about how these experiences and maybe others really influenced sort of the trajectory of your work in technoscience and race?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like with any kind of origin question, I can think of like multiple starting points, things that have set me off in a particular direction. And certainly my childhood in Los Angeles was part of that. I mean, the way that I sort of summarize it is that I, from a very early age, have looked at the world from its underbelly, you know, and so everywhere that I've lived has been the South. That is, the South is literally in the geography: South Central LA, South Carolina, Southern Africa, the South Pacific. Everywhere that I've gone has been the South. And so if you think about that, that's looking at, you know, the world from its underbelly, looking at, you know, who and what suffers in the name of progress, you know. And so there are many, many examples throughout my life where I've seen this dynamic of things being one way for one strata of people, but there's a parallel reality. There are those who have to experience a nightmare for others to experience a dream or a fantasy. And so I think that sensibility of being critical of, you know, what I'm being told or sold has grown over time and has just been applied to my fields of study. And I think specifically when it comes to science and technology, I think I was drawn to this particular area as trained as a sociologist, because in some ways we're told not to question these things. They're asocial, they're apolitical, they're in a bubble. You know, it's like you can talk about the economy, you can talk about healthcare and education, but you can't question technology or science. Somehow it's removed. At least at that time when I was starting out, it was. I think we burst that bubble now, and now it's much more up for grabs in terms of analysis and critique. So I think there's something about being a troublemaker and wanting to question things I'm told not to, that was also part of the recipe. And then, you know, there was something very specific about being a student in California at a time when I was watching this huge investment in this field of regenerative medicine that set me off more specifically into what I ended up doing. And again, going back to how I started the talk, it was seeing this excitement and, you know, optimism for what could be in the future of medicine, without at the same time investing in the here and now, and not seeing, you know, and sort of really this lopsided trajectory. And so again, that made me think, oh, okay, so the future is going to be great for a very small, you know, handful of people who can afford these amazing things, while the vast majority are going to be left out. And so I think moving from biotechnologies, now the data sciences and other fields, I think I bring the same set of questions about power and inequality, and the relationality of power, this idea that, you know, for some to be underserved, some have to be overserved, you know, like these things are relational. And so I think I sort of take that bag of questions with me no matter where. And in some ways it started being a kid, seeing those police helicopters in Los Angeles and thinking, oh, okay, for people on that side of town to feel safe, my community has to have the police on every corner and have these helicopters going overhead. And so that's where the criticality, I think, began.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I really do want to give other people an opportunity to ask questions. And our fellows have a few questions that they've already determined. But just back to the issue of law enforcement and your experience in South Central Los Angeles, you do talk also about this issue, or the strategic answer around abolition technology and bringing that into the abolitionist digital space.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's fascinating.
That's an example at the end of Race After Technology, where I essentially say I'm not saying technology has no role in, in these movements, but it really matters, what the values and the vision that's going into their design, like who's behind the screen and what their understanding is. And so Appolition is, an app that is trying to engender a more abolitionist approach to policing by crowdsourcing bail money for people who need it. And so when I download the app, when I purchase things, the spare change goes towards community bail funds that then use it to get people who are, pre-trial waiting trial. And so the designer of this app, Courtney Ziegler, he really is not trying to create a technological fix for policing, but trying to provide a tool for people who are already doing this work in our communities on the ground, and asking them what would be useful to them rather than imposing sort of a top-down solution. So it's one of a few. And there was another one that I think I just dropped in the chat of a virtual and augmented reality. I was going to show you guys a video, but my audio is not working. Oh, I'll drop it in now. I'd love everyone to go watch this video after the presentation. It's another technology that's trying to foster connection and healing. And Breonna's garden is named after Breonna Taylor, who we know was killed by police. And so her family joined forces with a team of designers to create this. It's an app and a virtual reality experience that honors Breonna, that takes her passion for nursing. We know that she was, trying to become a nurse, and she was working as an EMT. And they take her passion for nursing and channel it into collective healing. And so in some ways, they describe it as transforming their pain into her purpose, and spreading her purpose through this technology that fosters and allows people to share their grief and their hopes. So, for a very tangible example of how technology can be directed towards social justice and healing, I would love for you all to go watch that clip after we get off the call to sort of get some inspiration for that.
Thank you. That's great. And we will be saving all of these links and making them available to folks who signed up for the webinar. So in case you're not able to access it now. Professor Wilson, Dr. Wilson, I'd like to turn it over to you and some of the pre-authored questions. And yes, I know numerous in the Q&A. So
yes, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. So let's get to them. There is a question from one of our participants. How do we reconcile the idea that race is an integral part of our identities as humans, but that it can also be used to promote or subjugate bias, as seen in the case of how technology has disproportionately affected people of color? And so this particular participant wants to know, should we strive towards minimizing race as an identity to point to the point of color blindness, or should we, or should it be embraced, or should we embrace race as an integral part of an individual's identity?
Yeah, such a good question. I teach a whole course on these questions, and so I can give you a reading list. I won't do it justice in this short, response, but I think that there's some distinctions, that are useful when we're thinking about how race function, the duality of race that you're describing, that race is both we self-identify, but it's also ascribed, it's imposed on us, right? And so to some extent, you're asking many of us have a lot of pride and connection based on these racial identities, but when things are imposed on us based on our race, that's where the oppressive nature of racism comes into play. And so specifically in the context of health and medicine, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to debunk the notion of biological race and biological determinism, and at the same time become much more conscious and insightful about social race, about the social processes that are organized around these racial, categories. And so it requires a lot of us, right? Because on the one hand, we need to stop being so biologically deterministic and think, oh, because of this race that you have, this is what I expect to see in your body and your culture. It's reductive. It reduces people to these racial categories. At the same time, we need to understand how race is functioning at the societal level, how it impacts our housing, our work experiences, our stress levels, how much sleep we get, our familial dynamics. So it shapes and impacts all of these areas that have to go into our analysis, our understanding. And it's not shouldn't be tied to only things that are negative, which is what you're getting at, right? In terms of kinship and culture and, you know, our networks. So we also have to understand the generative aspect of race in many ways. And so I think one of the things that is a useful thing is for us to expand our vocabulary around this so we can be a little more discerning on what we're talking about, whether the harmful or the productive and generative, rather than calling everything race or everything racism, right? We need to have a more discerning vocabulary. And that's what a lot of the literature in this arena helps us do, so we can have more meaningful conversations that lead to action.
Well, I would love to hear more, or at least receive more links to that literature so that we can share out to our students and other participants. Let's get on to another question. So how can technology be ethically and effectively leveraged to improve police accountability and equity, especially considering the potential for built-in bias in technological systems and the necessity for this technological humility, and the examples where technology has either improved or hindered justice? Can you provide those examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me read this over to myself. Yeah, this is in some ways, this is what the race app, the whole book, that particular book is really trying to parse out. And I think where I come down on this is that there are certain institutions and processes for which being more discerning about, you know, how we design technology, we should invest in that. But policing is not one of them. That is to say, there is not a way to effectively develop better technologies that will improve policing, because policing is inherently violent and racist. It's not over policing that's the problem. It is inherent to the function of this particular institution. And so where I fall on that is that, you know, to the extent that we're trying to develop tools to make policing nicer, more humanistic, less biased, that those resources and energy should go into other things that actually function to make us safer, rather than pouring more money into it. So you remember, after many of these murders, people call for, you know, body cams or other ways to hold police accountable. But none of that has proved effective. In fact, since the murder of George Floyd, we've had, with all of the attention, all of the statements of support, with cities painting Black Lives Matter on their boulevards, we've had more police murders since then. And so the particular police force that actually killed George Floyd, it was a very progressive police force. They did mindfulness training, they did community, neighborhood, you know, relationship building, all of the reforms that people say, oh, this is what we need to adopt. That police force was already doing it. And yet this brother still got lynched in broad daylight. And so, to the first part of the question, I think that is in some ways the wrong focus, that we don't need to leverage technology for greater police accountability. We need to think about how to use those resources. And my latest book, Viral Justice, provides examples of what that looks like. What does non-police responses to emergencies look like? And many locales throughout the country are experimenting with this and working on these things. Like, how do you actually respond to crises and harm without relying on the function of the police? And so that's where I would say, in this case, it's not a new technology that we need, it's a stronger social fabric. And so in some ways, I think this applies to other areas. We should ask ourselves, does this particular problem actually need new technologies? Or is there something that we can do in terms of our social sort of relationships and our know-how as communities that would actually function to address the problem. And so I'll leave it at that, just because I've said a lot, but I think my response there applies to other areas where we're told, oh, let's leverage technology to do X, Y, and Z. So we should always ask, okay, is that necessary in this case? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Thank you so much for that answer. I mean, I think it's really difficult for our students, and actually, I think all of us, right? This is a relatively new area of study for most. You may have spent the better part of several years studying it yourself, but I think for us in applying it to public health, it's and the challenges that are inherently in even the public health field, it's relatively new. And with that, another student asks, do you have any suggestions for where public health practitioners can find ways to interrupt the current trajectory of medical technology, especially when it seems that these codes, quote unquote, are designed by a select privileged few?
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the resources that I think someone did drop the link in the chat already. I think it's a good place to start. The whole set of interventions around structural competency. I feel like that's one place to start, is to really build up that model and try to put that into practice. But in terms of specifically saying interrupting this top down, these technologies that were sold, I think as a starting point is not something that we can all do as a starting point, is not to be mystified by these technologies, not to feel like, oh, this is some special arena that you don't get a say in unless you get a PhD in computer science, And so part of it is to say, actually, the issues are too important that we're dealing with in terms of tech-mediated harms to leave it to those who simply have the technological know-how, who they just have the technical expertise. These are people creating tools that are going to impact health, education, work, that have no insight into how education, work, health, how these arenas function, the forms of inequality that are, shaping them. And yet they have the gall, the hubris to try to produce interventions and tools that impact all of these arenas. And so as a starting point, as public health professionals and people who might feel like, oh, so far removed from the tech scene, you have forms of knowledge that the people creating these technologies do not have. And so oftentimes we hear, like people say, oh, the public needs more scientific literacy in order to do X, Y, and Z. And my response is, well, technologists and scientists need more social literacy. They need more public health literacy. They need more, And so part of it is to really own what you do know about how the world operates and bring that to the conversation and the public debate about any of these issues.
Thank you so much.
So we have another question. This is from Arthur Camargo, who's asking, talking about the health disparities in terms of diagnosis to folks discussing the presence of them. He asked, why not go to where darker skinned folks live and see how they handle diagnosis? They said that the issue with that is that many places use Western medicine as the model, where the disparity is written into the model. How do we begin to change this model to acknowledge the disparities that exist in that space?
That's a hard one without knowing the specific context in which because this sounds like a very specific exchange that you've had with people. So I think I'm going to have to hunt on it, just because whatever response I give is going to be a little too general without knowing the context.
Sure. I actually do have another question. It's to the point where you discuss, again, back to your book, the abolitionist toolkit and how folks committed to health equities can really engage in these efforts towards social change. So I know you have a number of sort of strategies that you talked about in your presentation, but that you also kind of really detail out in your book in terms of this toolkit. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah,
Love
absolutely.
toolkits in public health, right?
It's the kind of thing where oftentimes when I'm thinking of toolkits, I'm thinking in two ways. I'm thinking about one, conceptual tools, because concepts and frameworks are lenses that bring certain things into view that often are out of view so that we can't address them. So one is to understand that our ideas are powerful and concepts are part of this toolkit. So those concepts that I laid out right at the very end in terms of resisting biological determinism, cultural determinism, technological determinism, fostering cultural humility and structural competency, those for starters are part of our toolkit. They're lenses that we can understand certain things. The other thing that comes to mind with toolkits that I go into a little bit in the book is really to understand our social technologies, that is, our relationships, our organizing, the organizations that we're part of. That should be part of our toolkit. A lot of times we want things that are kind of only individually oriented, like they're things that I will do myself, which is important. But what I'm really encouraging us to do when we're in professions that are both being affected by these problems and are reproducing the problems is to have one foot outside of those contexts and link arms with those who are on the front lines and working. And that's why I provided those examples of, community organizations and advocacy groups, because I found it to be useful not to spend most of my time just talking to other academics, but to actually go to the Data for Black Lives conference, go and work alongside people in the Detroit Community Technology Project. So part of it, to understand that your toolkit is also your connections, your network, your relationships, and to think about who you need to be in conversation with and working alongside to deepen your analysis and to course correct. When you think you're doing something useful and productive, when you're working alongside people who have a different perspective, then that becomes evident very quickly rather than you going down the wrong rabbit hole. And so thinking about your relationships and your ideas as part of your toolkit.
I absolutely love that, because, it's almost like, where you talk about in your other book, which I really encourage people to take a look at, viral justice and how we want to grow the world. I think it's really empowering, because I think when we do think about technology, we feel powerless, right? Especially for those that's not our experience, or we don't think it's our experience. So I think we really appreciate you basically suggesting we have those tools already, communal living. We already understand that, right? But really kind of giving us sort of the landscape to let us know that we can redesign, we can reimagine what we want this world to look like. So I really appreciate these important reminders that I think we forget about.
You already know it. I'm just here to put a little underline under it. So
right. The ancestral knowing, as they say. So Dr. Wilson, I don't know if you had another question. I know it's late where Dr. Benjamin is, so we appreciate you staying up late to provide this remarkable, fascinating conversation that will give us all a lot to think about as we move into the end of 2023. But Dr. Wilson, if you had a couple of lasting remarks before we...
I think you all ended on a great note, and our students have, I think, their marching orders and what they can learn and how they can move forward to learn more about technology and how we can actually change both medicine and public health as we move forward. So we really do appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, to share your knowledge. And this is a great kickoff for our 9th year with the social justice series. And so again, we thank you and appreciate your time.
Thank you all for convening this. 9 years is a long time in academic years.
Yes.
Cheering you on. Hope it rubs off on me. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you for inviting me. Have a great rest of the year. Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.